Hi everyone, thanks for joining us again. Well, your child is brilliant, but when it comes to like simplest tasks, it's like they hit a wall. And a lot of people might judge and wouldn't agree, but it isn't laziness, it isn't defiance or a lack of effort. It's a hidden brain function that isn't turning on when it should. And no amount of discipline, rewards, or just try harder is going to fix it. That's why you need someone who actually gets it, someone who can break it down for us in a way that finally makes sense. And that's exactly why we have Dr. Claire Sierra with us today. Dr. Sierra, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. So I'm a neuropsychologist. I practice out of Victoria, British Columbia in Canada, long way away. And I've been working with adolescents and adults with ADHD for much of my practice because my PhD research was in executive functioning, which is a really important part of ADHD.
Such a pleasure having you today. Thank you. Let's start with this, Dr. Sierra. The big question: how fundamentally different is ADHD brain from a neurotypical brain? Are we talking about subtle differences, or is this a completely different operating system?
Operating system, I like that. So the brains of children, especially of children, and maybe with adults as well, are definitely different than the brains. So if they have ADHD, are definitely different than the brains of a child who does not have ADHD or another psychological diagnosis. The differences are somewhat subtle, I think, but there are many studies that show these differences, so we know that they are legitimate differences that can be found. A person with ADHD, their brain has less overall volume, so it's lighter, and weaker functioning of the prefrontal cortex, the very front, as well as weaker functioning of some of the subcortical, so underneath some of those structures in the limbic system and the basal ganglia. So I'll explain a little bit more. So that prefrontal cortex, this is a part of the brain that, I joke, it makes us different than our dogs. It regulates our behavior, our emotions, our attention. It allows us to control things in a different way than just react. The limbic system, this is a system that influences motivation, emotional response. ADHD-related changes to this system might contribute to hyperactivity, impulsivity, poor decision-making, and maybe difficulties with emotion regulation. Another deeper structure called the basal ganglia, it's responsible for motor learning. So when we learn to ride a bike, that's our basal ganglia doing that job for us, as well as our cerebellum. But this part of the brain seems to be less active, and that means regulating our behavior, our emotions, the ability to plan, focus, multitask, those are going to be weaker as well. We also know that people with ADHD, their brains have less efficient white matter connectivity. So some studies show fewer connections, some studies show more, but the understanding is that no matter what, it's less efficient, and the brain is trying to cope with that. So what that means is a person with ADHD, their brain doesn't talk to itself as well as it would otherwise. It's affecting a ton of parts of the brain and lots of networks: cognitive control, attention, timing, working memory, and then motivation and emotions. The operating system comment that you made, I don't think it's a different operating system. The ADHD brain works in the same fundamental way as a neurotypical brain. It just doesn't work as well for some specific cognitive functions.
Before we go on with this session, I just wanted to remind you that you can still upgrade to the Summit's VIP Pass. Beside the lifetime access to all the sessions, you also get the audio files, you get the workbook for each session, you get the expert action blueprints with key takeaways from each masterclass, you get the English subtitles, and really a bunch of other things that will save you tons of time and really make a huge difference with your kid and with your family relationships. So if you're a busy parent and you want to get the most out of the Summit, then I really encourage you to find the button somewhere on this page and go check it out. You can still get access at a discounted price before our Summit ends. And now, let's get you back to the program. And what about the ventral attention system? This is responsible for noticing critical changes in our environment, right? How does that impact everyday life for someone with ADHD? What are the real world consequences, would you say?
Because that's what we really care about, right? But that's exactly right. The ventral network responds to sort of infrequent or an unexpected event that's relevant to us. So if something relevant appears outside of my current spotlight of my attention, what I'm paying attention to right now, and something kind of happens out here in the peripheral vision area, that's going to grab me. So it's like a stimulus-driven attentional system. My attention will automatically shift to that stimulus. It happens automatically, not because I chose for that to happen. So that's an important part of that system. It's not under my control. So if a person with ADHD, like myself, is trying to pay attention to something, I might be less sensitive to things outside of my focused attention. Interestingly, if I didn't have ADHD, that distractibility, that dragging my attention to something in the periphery, that's actually suppressed. So I think that's a fundamental difference. So in real life, if I didn't have ADHD, I could probably focus better. But if I do have ADHD, that system is kind of grabbing things when it shouldn't. So I'm less able to ignore distractions from the outside. I'm also less able to ignore distractions from the inside. So internal thoughts can distract me too. I think we might even be less sensitive to important cues. So I might not orient to something that is relevant. I might appear to be zoned out or daydreaming. Or I might appear to be highly engaged. And we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, about hyperfocus. So in everyday life, this is going to have a big impact for people with ADHD.
Yeah. And what would you say? What does uh, what does that actually feel like? For someone living with ADHD, can you sense what you're missing? Kind of.
That is such an interesting question. Do you know what you don't know? From my own experience, there are some times where I have a subtle sense that maybe I've forgotten something or I'm missing something. So, for example, when I'm leaving the house, I might have a sense of unease, and if I ignore it, chances are I will get to work without my lunch. Let's say, like that sense of unease was trying to tell me something. So I've learned actually to listen to that sense of unease. It's usually my intuition talking to me, and I've tried to become more sensitive to it. But I think actually the impaired functioning of the ventral attention system is a little bit different from that. When a person with ADHD is hyperfocused, let's say, on something interesting, their brains simply aren't registering anything else in the environment. So when their attention is dragged away, they might be a little bit confused or even irritable, almost like they've just woken from a dream. I don't think they can sense what they're missing. I think they are completely unaware.
Okay. And speaking of that, can you actually train your ventral attention system to be more responsive, or is it just the way your brain is wired?
I'm really curious about this. Yes, having a weaker ventral attention system is how the brain is wired, but our brains are hungry for stimulation. Whether or not we have ADHD, the brains want stimulation. And through the magic of neuroplasticity, we can change our brains throughout our lives. So really the question is going to be, does practicing a specific task that requires the brain to respond to stimuli that is outside of the spotlight of attention and then repeatedly reorient attention back to the task, does doing practice of that activity help us with other tasks that require ventral attention? I mean, that's a million-dollar question, I think. There's always been a limiting factor to this kind of cognitive rehabilitation brain training activity, though. To my knowledge, the programs and games that are intended to build cognitive functions, they're limited. They might help us be better at that specific task, but the improvements do not generalize to real life activities, which is where we really want to see them.
Sure. And let's talk about another system. It's called dorsal attention system, if I'm not mistaken, and that's responsible for goal-oriented, goal-directed focus. So how does that system interact, or maybe fail to interact, with the ventral attention system in ADHD?
These two systems are really important and they do work together. So ventral means underside. So the ventral attention system is literally like underneath kind of the bottom of the brain. The dorsal attention system is up on the top on the outside. So that's all it refers to. It's literally their location. So the ventral attention network, it mediates what we call bottom-up processing. So bottom-up shifts in attention to relevant stimuli in our environment. So it's involuntary, reflexive redirection of attention based on maybe novelty or importance of that stimuli. It's like a circuit breaker. It overrules our immediate attentional priorities and reallocates those resources to a new target if it seems like it's relevant to us. The dorsal system, on the other hand, is controlled in a top-down way. It's a voluntary control of attention. So we get to decide where attention goes, depending on whatever our frontal lobes decide our priorities are in that moment. So ideally, in a neurotypical brain, there's extensive connections between the dorsal and the ventral attention systems. So we want to fluidly be redirecting our attention according to our priorities, right? Like that's what we want. If something unexpected comes up, we want to notice that and then decide it's relevant, come back to our priorities. But because the ventral attention system is weak in someone with ADHD, I think it's reasonable to think that it probably doesn't interact with the dorsal system as efficiently as it would have otherwise.
So if we're talking about the ventral attention system who is weak or less active, on the other side, there's a default mode network that is hyperactive or active, right? Does that mean these individuals are, always thinking then, always processing, almost like a brain that never turns off? How does that look like?
That's a reasonable way to think about it, I think. But there's something important, I guess I should point out. The default mode network is an unconscious process. It's how our brain thinks and solves problems outside of conscious awareness. So while our brain is always thinking and solving problems about lots of different things, when our mind is otherwise unoccupied, so when we're not focused on something, for people with or without ADHD, that would be true. We're not aware. No one is aware of what's happening in the default mode network until that network kicks it up, and now it's in our conscious mind and focus of our conscious attention, and we have the information that it gave us. And this often feels like an aha moment. The default mode network is able to access all of the knowledge that we've ever gained in our lives, whereas our conscious attention is much more limited and small. It relies on our working memory, and so we can't have all our knowledge in that moment. The interesting thing about the default mode network is it's important for it to be active, but it's also important for it to be deactivated sometimes. So deactivation is just as important as activation. So the degree of deactivation seems to be critically important to aid control of our attention. People who can suppress it more seem to learn more efficiently. So if the person has ADHD and have a hyperactive default mode network, it means it's still active. It never turns off, right? So it's still active even when we're trying to focus on a specific task. So I agree that the brain of a person with ADHD is always active, but I don't think that we perceive that excess activity outside of maybe being more distractible to our own thoughts and maybe having more difficulty learning information. There is something interesting about this. Methylphenidates, one of the stimulant medications that's commonly used for ADHD, it's associated with suppression of that default mode network during cognitive tasks, and it seems to improve the connectivity, like the communication between brain structures. So maybe that's one of the ways it works.
Sure. Now, I know that some people with ADHD describe their brain as, this constant, like a radio that won't turn off, like constant thoughts, constant noise. But on the other hand, some people say it's just their mind is quiet. How can two people with, the same diagnosis experience their minds so differently?
That is pretty interesting. I think it's possible that these two individuals have more than one thing going on. Having ADHD doesn't mean you might not also have another problem. Sadly, it's an equal opportunity diagnosis. So even if the person is diagnosed as being inattentive, their brain is still highly active. It doesn't mean their mind is quiet. It just means it's not active about the things that are outside of them that maybe their teacher or their parent wants them to be aware of. A very quiet or blank mind, that does not sound like a symptom of ADHD, but it does sound like a dissociative moment. So while individuals with ADHD might dissociate, nothing I've read suggests dissociation is a core symptom of ADHD.
Okay, got it. Now let's talk a bit about hyperfocus, because when something does actually catch the ADHD brain's attention, it kind of locks in. Can you explain, Dr. Sierra, what's happening there? What parts of the brain take over?
Hyperfocus is pretty interesting, isn't it? So it reflects complete absorption in a task, just like you said, to be locked in. The person is completely focused, and really they're ignoring or tuning out everything else. It usually occurs when the activity is engaging or fun, and it's common in the literature on ADHD, on autism, and also in schizophrenia, interestingly. So during hyperfocus, task performance improves. We're usually better at whatever we're doing when we're in that hyperfocus place. So the dorsal attention network, the voluntary network control, that's focused attention, so it's going to be active during hyperfocus. The weaker ventral attention system might not be able to break through, which is what allows for hyperfocus. Whatever's going on in the environment, it's not enough to break it through. I actually think people without ADHD sometimes experience this, but they call it flow. And I do wonder if the experience of flow is based on the same structures as the experience of hyperfocus.
That's food for thought. Right? Dr. Sierra, what would you then say in this case of hyperfocus? Would you call it a strength, or could it be, kind of also an emotional shield, something the brain clings to so it doesn't have to face difficult feelings, difficult transitions, tasks, or stuff like that? What's your point of view?
I don't think hyperfocus is a tool that the brain uses to avoid difficult feelings. I think that actually might be what dissociation is used for, especially if the person has a history of trauma. It certainly helps us avoid difficult feelings and thoughts and memories. Hyperfocus absolutely does make transitions harder for people because they are going to struggle to pull out of whatever they're focused on, and they might have that confused or irritable reaction. I think it's important to stress that hyperfocus is not something that a person with ADHD can do on purpose. So I don't think then that it could be something that the brain is using to avoid transitions or to procrastinate tasks they don't want to do. I think it's more like flow. It's something that happens spontaneously under the right conditions. No one I've spoken to has ever said that they can call up the ability to hyperfocus whenever they want. I mean, that would be awesome if we could do that. But really, whether or not we define hyperfocus as a strength, it might depend on the person's situation. If you're able to get into hyperfocus relatively frequently, and that supports goal-directed activity, then it's a strength. But if you're hyperfocusing on things that take you away from the things that you maybe should be doing that would help make your life better, then we wouldn't consider it a strength. As with most things, it's really dependent on context.
And there's a lot of people with ADHD that describe this time blindness they're experiencing. This is the feeling of, constantly underestimating or overestimating time. Can you break down, neurologically, what's really happening?
I'm not sure we totally understand this, so I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly what's going on. But I think time blindness and the difficulty, to accurately assess the passage of time is related to that weakness in the connectivity of the frontal lobes with other brain structures. And you're correct. The internal sense of time passing and the ability to estimate, how long it might take to do something, it does seem to be weaker. It's one of those genuine weaknesses. It's possible that one of the factors that contribute to this is limited working memory. So that ability to hold information in mind and work with it, that's our working memory. And the ability to keep track of time passing is going to be an extra demand on our working memory. And so if our working memory and our attention is engaged, we might not actually have space or room for things like the ticking clock, the changing time, the alerts, the alarms. Even if it's right in front of us, we might be full, as it were.
Okay, and speaking of time blindness, I know you want to share the story about missing your bus because you're so focused on reading. Was there a moment in your life where maybe ADHD completely hijacked your day in a way that left you thinking, I can't believe I just
oh my goodness, so many moments. And yes, I did miss that bus. And my boss at the time was not happy with me. He had to come and get me. It was ridiculous. Anyway, how much time do you have? So many moments, right? Especially before I got diagnosed in my early 40s. I was a late diagnosis. I had my PhD before I got diagnosed. I would say the most regrettable moments for me are when I'm tired and my ability to inhibit. So I might be in a meeting that's irritating, and I'm not as able to inhibit my irritability. So my control is diminished. And I might end up using my outside voice and saying things that I wouldn't ordinarily say. And I would say those are the times I regret the most.
Okay, let's not talk about burnout first. I know many people who push themselves to the limit because they don't realize they're overcommitted until they crash to the bottom. What's the sign behind why ADHD brains don't recognize burnout until it's really too late?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think people with ADHD overcommit themselves, and there's lots of reasons for this. Again, we have poor estimation of the time that might take to do a new task, so we might underestimate it. I think have a hard time appreciating complexity of new tasks. It's hard to think through all the steps that could be involved in a task before we start. We're going to procrastinate, which means that we don't know what a task might involve until we're getting crunched for time. The adrenaline kicks in and wakes us up enough to actually start the task, and then we realize, oh my God, it's really complicated. And lastly, and maybe more importantly, and I can certainly relate to this, the desire for novelty and a tendency to be impulsive means something shiny and new is going to come my way, and I'm going to excitedly say yes. And so that's a problem. Are people with ADHD less sensitive to the early signs of burnout? Yes, probably. We know that there's reduced connectivity between the frontal lobes and the insular cortex. Most people haven't heard of the insular cortex, so I'll give you a little bit of a summary. In a person with ADHD, the insula is highly, or sorry, in a person without ADHD, the insula, so we have the frontal cortex, we have the temporal cortex, and if you pull back the temporal cortex underneath is the insula. It's kind of deep near your limbic system. So if you don't have ADHD, that part of your brain is heavily connected to the frontal lobes. Lots of back and forth conversation. Also really connected to the parietal lobe, which is back here, and that's the sensory integration area. And so our sensory information comes into this place and gets integrated in our parietal lobe, and that talks to the insula. So ideally, the insula helps you sense your body's internal state. It's constantly monitoring your body's systems. It brings relevant information to your awareness. If you're hungry, you're anxious, you're excited, you're in pain, your insula is going to notice these internal states, and it's going to give you information about that through those connections to the frontal lobes. Last, but certainly not least, the insula plays a crucial role in social cognition and empathy. So it helps you read other people's emotions and respond appropriately. That gut feeling I talked about earlier? I think that's your insula talking. If it helps you interpret and respond to signals, emotions, it kind of acts as a bridge between your body and your mind. So if the insula and the frontal lobes, which is where you decide what action is going to be taken, if they're not communicating properly, then the individual might not be as sensitive to the signals their body is sending, and they might not act accordingly.
And is ADHD burnout different from regular burnout? Is it maybe more intense, deeper, or harder to recover from? What's your point of view?
I don't think so. I think burnout symptoms are the same, regardless of whether or not one has ADHD. So people with ADHD might have a higher risk for burnout for the reasons we just said, and the causes of burnout might be different. People with ADHD may well have more daytime, daily hassles and daily stressors and the ADHD tax. They might spend a lot of energy masking, which depletes their resources. So while the causes might be different and they might have increased risk, I think burnout ultimately is the same.
Thanks for explaining. And does burnout in ADHD just kind of happen in the moment, or does it, build over time, layer by layer, until the brain really learns to expect exhaustion as a way of life, really?
Gosh, that would be depressing. Burnout's not a sudden event. If it's a sudden event, we probably call it collapse. Back in the history books, we would call that kind of collapse consumption. Then we started calling it nervous breakdown, but I think it's the same thing. It's a collapse. So burnout has built up over time and led to collapse. Initially, the symptoms of burnout are going to be subtle with a gradual progression in severity. And so I think people might be aware of some negative changes. They might have, their mood might be dropping, but it's not the same as depression. They might be a little bit more negative in their thinking, or their thinking might be foggy. They might have some changes in physical functioning. They're tired, maybe they get sick more, but they might not recognize what's happening. So if you're not good at noticing the signals that your body's sending you, you're probably going to be in burnout longer before taking that appropriate action. Your question about what the brain expects around exhaustion is interesting to me. I don't think the brain ever expects exhaustion as a way of life. Our brains don't really have opinions about themselves or about things. Our brain is simply trying to keep us safe and healthy and protect us from harm. It's designed, it just tells our body to move us around, right, to keep us protected and safe. And so the brain of a person who's burned out or burning out is still going to try and protect that person, but that doesn't mean the person can't override the signals of distress and ignore those signals that their body is sending.
Right, got it. Now, hypothetically, Dr. Sierra, if tomorrow we had a breakthrough in neuroscience that allowed us to fully understand ADHD, what do you think it would reveal? What's the missing piece we haven't quite put together yet?
Gosh, I don't know. There's a lot of research happening in a lot of different parts of brain science and relevant to ADHD. I think I don't know if a breakthrough will tell us anything about ADHD specifically, but I think we might have a treatment breakthrough. Neurotherapeutics, so that's using technology and devices to change how our brains work. This is an exciting area, I think, for ADHD. And I think if we could find a safe and potentially longer-term neuroplastic treatment, so that really once you finish the treatment, your brain changes remain, which is not necessarily true when you take medication, I think we'd really be on something that would feel like a breakthrough to me. Of course, these things need to be thoroughly tested. We have to have short-term, long-term clinical trials, but I think the potential for individualized treatment here is good. I'm excited.
Sure. And let's talk about the trend, calling ADHD a superpower. Would you say that actually empowers people, or does it minimize the very challenges that they really face? What's your opinion?
I think it depends on the person, and with no disrespect to those who consider their ADHD a superpower, I personally do not consider it a superpower. I see the devastation it causes to people's lives every week. I see what it does to my own life. I think calling it a superpower has the potential for shaming those of us who are struggling, so I don't use it.
Thanks for sharing that. Does ADHD brain have any natural advantages compared to neurotypical brains?
I think so. Some people might argue that increased activity of the default mode network allows the ADHD brain to connect patterns more easily. It might contribute to creative fluency, so generating innovative ideas more easily. I am an idea machine. They're not all great ideas, but I couldn't stop them if I wanted. So I think that's a strength.
Exactly. I believe so too. If you could describe an ADHD brain in just 3 words, what would they be?
Well, I'll speak for myself. Curious, impulsive, busy.
And the last question for you, Dr. Sarah. If there was a perfect career for the ADHD brain, what would it be?
People with ADHD often tell me that they don't like structure, but they benefit so much from structure. So there's a real tension and push-pull there. I think a job that is structured with some flexibility and autonomy is ideal. The job would have some public accountability, meaning supervisor, colleague, manager, coach. Somebody is aware of what you're doing, and so there's some external deadlines because we need that little bit of pressure to get started on a task. Regular check-ins, I think, are quite critical. So if you're working in an office, that kind of public, people are around, they can see if you're working, that can be helpful, and some people have told me that. Other people say, I can't handle all the visual distractions and the noises, it makes me lose my mind, so I need to work from home. Either way, check-ins are important. A job that has immediate and enjoyable consequences for each step, for each part of the task, that can really be helpful. So if it's a big multi-step task where it feels like a marathon, the person's motivation is going to flag right away. And so having that task be chunked up, and the person with ADHD might need help doing that. I think that, and then having little celebrations, little like, check, yay, done. I think that would be ideal for someone with ADHD.
Thank you. Thanks for explaining. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do this conversation. It was lovely, and I believe you left our listeners with a much deeper understanding of the ADHD brain. Thank you so much for joining us.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Are you loving the advice and insights you're getting? Well, you can get lifetime access to all the summit sessions when you upgrade your ticket to the VIP pass. This means you're not only getting unlimited access to the sessions, you will also unlock the audio version of the entire summit, expert action blueprints with key takeaways and action steps, English subtitles, and a brilliant workbook that will help you implement everything that you can. You see, the VIP pass is purposely designed to help you digest all of the content from the summit and implement this advice in your own life. And as you know, the internet is flooded with advice about ADHD, but how much of it actually comes from credible sources? how many times have you been led astray by unknown or unverified advice? Well, unlimited access to the entire summit is a place where information is not only just abundant, it's also trustworthy. So if you want to be confident in the ADHD strategies every step of the way, then I think this is a place to start. I'm totally positive that you're going to love the VIP pass and all of the valuable resources that we have created for you. It's like having a personal library of expert knowledge right in your pocket. And here's the best part. If for any reason at all you don't love it, we'll refund you in full. No questions asked. So you really have nothing to lose. Grab your VIP pass now and don't miss this opportunity.